Hi, my name is Luke Bates, and I will be trying to make the audio for this movie clip. Time is actually still, so you can see all the action, and the camera just floats in between the bits of paper and around the explosions and past the bullets, and it's all filmed with no time. So the storyline is you can see police, there's clowns, and it looks like the police are chasing down the clowns because they've just committed some sort of robbery. As you go towards the end, the camera comes down onto a policeman who's obviously jumped out that window. He's on top of this car, and there's a mask beside him, and that makes you think, well, is he a clown? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? And it just leaves you questioning what you've actually just saw, and it invites you to watch it again. So the way I'm going to approach this is by making two interpretations of the video, and I'm going to lay them up at the end in two sort of layers. The first one is going to be how I'm going to tackle the problem of having no time in the video. Like, how am I going to represent that as sound? And when I've done that, that's going to be one layer. And then the second layer is actually going to be the way I interpret this video to mean, and it's going to be my explanation of the story. So the way this is happening is all the waves that there are, like the heat waves, the light waves, the sound waves, just because time's frozen doesn't mean they don't exist. They're still there, they're just frozen in the space that they're in. So as this camera moves around, this camera acts like a tape head. So if you run through a song and you scroll the tape head to a certain part of that song, you're playing it from a certain time. And it's the same principle. This camera is like a tape head flowing through those acoustic waves or light waves. And so every part of this video is a snapshot of that time and that space. So we can kind of say that time equals space when there is no time. So I'm going to explain this in a presentation just to make it a bit clearer. Okay, so this is a time pause simulation, and we're going to try and explain how a waveform could still exist and be listened to even if there's no time where that wave can travel. So we've just got two-axis graph here, and one of our main markers is the 1 second mark where the sound will have travelled 340 meters, taking into account the normal air density and temperature. So this is the waveform our gun would make. It looks the other way around because if you imagine that waveform travelling away from the sound source, you'd have the peak first and the tail afterwards. So it's not the same waveform as you'd see if you imported that sample into Logic or Ableton or whatever. Like normally would have the peak first, tail afterwards. If you imagine this waveform travelling away from the sound source along this graph in this direction, you'd hear the tail first, peak afterwards. Okay, so the gun was fired, and the sample, that sound travelled away from the gun, reaching in 1 second 340 meters. That's what you'd expect. Now if we pause time half a second into that gunfire, this is where our waveform would lie. If our sample was 0.1 seconds long, like, we can't be completely accurate here, we're just saying that this sample is 0.1 seconds long just to make the maths easier, and it's a rough guess. But if it was 0.1 seconds long, this wave sample would have a realistic length of 34 meters. So the tail end would reach 170, the peak, would reach 170, and the tail end would still be traveling behind it, and the edge would be 136 meters away from the sound source. So from this you can gather that between the sound source and the waveform, there's 136 meters of silence, and afterwards, from 170 onwards, there's also silence. You might have some disturbance in this area, but mathematically, I'm not going to work that out. So a thing to note is that if you were moving towards the sound source, it would be the same principle as if the waveform was moving past your ears. So you'd hear the waveform as normal, peak first, tail afterwards. Again, you could only hear it in that area between 136 and 170 meters. And in contrast, if you move in the other direction, away from the sound source, you'd hear it between 136 and 170, but you hear the tail first and then you'd hear the peak, so the waveform would be in reverse. Okay, so in this example we've approximated the times. We can't be sure exactly how long this sample is. 0.1 seconds is just an estimation that's made the maths a bit easier. We've also not included the fact that in a real environment you'd get echoes and reverberations that comes from the floor, walls, objects, anything like that. The speed of sound is not always 340 meters per second. If the air temperature is different, or if it's traveling through different materials like water, that all affect the speed of sound, and so we've just assumed perfect conditions for this. If you were to include all those other conditions, and you knew exactly how long this sample length was, and you could use the speed of light to work out exactly how far into this action time was paused, you could put all those together and build a 3D simulation of where that waveform is at any given point in space and time. So you could say that shot was fired 0.134 seconds ago, and that means the sound would have reached this far in a spherical fashion, and yeah, you could build an acoustic waveform simulation. So anyway, we're just going to apply this law of time pause to the rest of the sound sources in the clip. Now this is going to create the opposite effect of what you'd expect. If you're going past a gunshot, for example, you'd expect to hear that waveform increase the closer you got to the sound source, but in fact the way we're doing it is that you'll hear the sound source a distance from the gun, and as you get closer you won't hear that gun, but then as you get further away you'll hear that waveform in reverse. So we're not going to create the traditional whooshing sound as we go past something. This is going to be totally different, and it's probably going to end up like a mess of noise that doesn't seem to relate to the video, but it's just going to be one layer of it, and it's just representing the fact that there's no time. So the next part, once we figured out how we're going to represent time, is deciding on what sounds we're going to use, and this comes more to do with the second layer of the audio, and that's going to be interpreting the metaphors that are used within this clip. Now because this clip doesn't really make sense to me, and because there's no time, the only way I can interpret this clip is that it must be some sort of dream. It makes sense if it was a dream. There's no time, you've got this perspective that's flowing around, it's trying to make sense of things, it's giving you a story, and there's all these random concepts like police, clowns, hospital. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless it's a dream. So the way I'm interpreting these sounds is simply I'm just going to use Dream Interpretation Book to find out what these objects mean. Okay, so this is just a little table which explains how I'm going to decide what sounds I'm going to use for the concepts. Okay, I'm not going to go through this and explain every sentence. Basically, there's the main concept, ideas, at the top left, and then followed by sub-concepts. I've got a meaning for each one, and then on the right hand side is the kind of sound that I want to get for it. So if you want, you could just pause it and take a look at how I'm going to go about making the second layer.